Welcome back to The Business, where I'm delighted to be joined by William Pollen, Program Director at Invest in Africa, to talk about the continent's economic and investment prospects for 2018. William, thank you very much for joining me.
Pleasure.
I want to start with where most discussions about Africa's prospects start, which is growth. We've had 2 years of pretty subdued growth. We're finally getting a bit of good news. The World Bank is forecasting 3.2% for sub-Saharan Africa. In general, there are signs that growth is starting to pick up again after a pretty difficult period. How excited should we be?
I think we should be realistically excited, cautiously optimistic. All those cliches. I mean, the numbers I've seen move from 3.4 to 4.3 for 2018. But the danger is, as ever, that we talk about such a vast continent with one brush and one number. And as ever the case for us, there are huge opportunities out there, but it's about picking horses for courses. And it's a patchwork quilt that you've got to navigate your way through, and that's the tricky part, and that's where the growth is.
So I can tell that you're an Africa veteran, because immediately you're stressing the need for nuance. Now, and I'll get back to this, you said we need to be realistically optimistic about this, but there are some pretty strong performers in there as well. So I'm looking at some IMF figures here. Ghana, 8.9%, Cote d'Ivoire 7.3%, Ethiopia 8.5%. I mean, these are strong growth figures, right? So it goes to your point around, we can't generalize here.
Sure, and I think it's no great surprise that the numbers from some of those countries, they are non-oil exporting nations, so they've benefited from the downturn in the commodities prices. And as ever, there's winners and losers with every scenario. As the oil price is picking up again, maybe those sorts of markets will slip back, and you'll see the Nigerias, the Angolas, the Ghanas, etc., picking up again. So I don't think it's time to look for generalizations. There is sectors that are performing well across the continent consistently. Look at manufacturing, growing 6% from just 4 or 5 years ago, services up 4%, all of which are indicative of a growing middle class, and I use that term loosely, but it's there to be. The answer is in the numbers. The number of people in what you would call a middle class category, and they're driving consumption.
There's a flip side here, which is that we've been here before. Since between 2000 and about 2014, when the commodity slump really started to bite, we had average growth of 5%. We had economies growing in the double digits. Ethiopia has recorded double-digit growth for many years, but we haven't necessarily seen the development impact. We haven't necessarily seen the impact in terms of job creation. Is that what you're talking about when you say we need to be a bit realistic here as well?
Yeah, I think so, and I think the trend that we're seeing from what we do at Invest in Africa is very much that one about job creation. That is the number one of every government's inbox. Doesn't matter who they are, where they are, what their numbers say. Job creation is a huge challenge. When you've got 60-70% of an entire nation's population represented by people under 30, 35, that's not going to change overnight. So local content, jobs, those are always going to be top of a government's agenda, and as a result, they should be top of any smart business's agenda too.
We can say a lot more about it. We have to move on. What is all this doing to investor sentiment? What have you seen in the last 18 months or so? We have had a dip. We all know that Africa has its challenges when it comes to attracting investment, especially attracting foreign investment. Do you think that we can anticipate an improvement in terms of sentiment towards the continent as growth figures rebound, as commodities rebound?
I think so, to some extent. I mean, look, would you rather be invested $10 in a market that's growing at 4.3% or $20 in a market that's growing at 2% like Europe is? And look at Europe. You've got Spain, Germany, UK. Who knows what lies ahead for those markets? Coalitions, Brexit, etc.
Yeah, exactly. Brexit.
And then you could put Turkey into that bracket. Who knows what lies ahead? So there's political uncertainty around every corner. Africa tends to get a more negative press on it, and yet the opportunity is there and the stability is there. The governance is improving across the continent. The Mobrahim index, that's well quoted, has shown consistent improvements in all categories. So I think there's every reason to be positive. But you need to look for the sectors that are growing and in the markets that suit you. And for us, it's about a long-term mindset.
But surely it must have had an impact, though. In 2016, the IMF says Sub-Saharan Africa had recorded the lowest growth in 20 years. Surely that sort of put people off a little bit. I take your point that if you look closely, but have you found it harder over the last 12 months or so to get people interested in Africa, or are you seeing perhaps a maturing of the investor base?
I think you're seeing, a maturing of the investor base. I mean, surveys that have come out consistently now, 7-8 years, things like the EY Africa Attractiveness Survey that look at people currently invested in Africa and new investors haven't changed from day one. People already invested in the continent remain positive, optimistic, they see the opportunities. People new, they go up and down with sentiment. So for those that are already invested, they can see and understand the opportunity. And it's like most things in life. You need to get on the ground. You need to see, smell and feel it and roll your sleeves up. And until you've done that, you will be making very speculative decisions.
You're on the ground. Elaborate on some of these opportunities. What would you be looking at? If you were one-on-one with a potential investor right now, what should they be looking at?
$64,000 question. Well, well, you've got massive opportunities driven by the consumption of the private sector. So I would look at things like healthcare, ICT, financial services, housing, energy, infrastructure. They're all increasingly receiving government support. Government's looking for PPPs on them, just like they are in Europe. You look at someone like Kenya, where 45% of the entire GDP is driven through the M-Pesa platform. You look at how Nigeria is coming back from its dependency on oil in terms of GDP. It's still heavily dependent for foreign currency from oil, 90% or thereabouts, but its actual GDP numbers, 10% on oil versus 20 only 5-6 years ago.
You're touching on a really key point here, which is the diversity of the investment profile across Africa, because we know it has natural resources, we know it has minerals, we know it has oil, but you've talked about retail, you've talked about technology, you've talked about media, and all of these sectors are coming on stream, which ties into the commodities rebound. Now, to some extent, an increased focus on some of these other sectors has been a byproduct of low prices for oil, low prices for minerals, and governments not being able to rely on the easy cash that comes with exporting raw materials. Is a potential flip side of us seeing the oil price coming back up that perhaps some of that momentum is lost? Maybe governments take their eye off the ball a little bit here.
I don't think so. Well, I hope not. I think governments are increasingly realizing that they have to diversify, and they're being held to account, more importantly. Social media is driving some of that, a more open media is driving that, and some of the governance schools and improvements are driving that. The stronger they have institutions on the ground, the more accountable they're held, the less they're going to take the eye off the ball. Look, I think the cash that African economies receive from commodities, and it's not just oil and gas, minerals, metals play a massive part of that, is driven through their exports to China, by and large. Still at 30% of all of Africa's exports going to China. And of that 30%, you're looking at 80 to 90% being in commodities. So it's still very, very important to the cash flow of Africa, if you like, but the balance sheet is being driven by the fundamentals. And when you look at those, you start to see growth from the private sector, middle class consumption, exactly the sort of goods and services that people expect and want in Europe and the States. And that's where I see the longer term opportunities.
Let's talk a little bit more about commodities. Oil breached $70 for the first time in 3 years. You do a lot of work in Ghana. Surely this is good news for countries that do export oil. It has to be good news for countries like Nigeria, Angola, even Algeria, that have really, really suffered as a result of the slump. How positive an impact can we expect here? Should we be celebrating the return of oil, even if there's some potential downside here?
I'm not sure celebrating, but I think looking forward to the opportunities it should create. I mean, we've been here before. Lessons have to be learnt. And if they're not, we've seen that ultimately governments pay the price. People expect revenue from these national goods to benefit them, whether that be directly through jobs or indirectly through improvements in services and infrastructure. Those lessons will no doubt continue to be learned. But certainly you look at the sort of programs that Ghana have successfully put in place the last 2-3 years, the IMF package that has been by and large received as a success, the capping of inflation coming right the way down to sort of 11% from 22, those sort of numbers. It can be done, and it has to be done.
I'm going to put you on the spot here a little bit. Do you think governments are learning some of those lessons? Are you seeing evidence? Could you point to any governments where you think that, look, the penny's dropped here, we can't just keep doing business as usual, we have to adapt, evolve, we have to move our economies forward?
Well, we're going to find out, right? I mean, the proof is in the pudding. We've got some big elections coming up. Nigeria is the obvious one, South Africa. And those two economies still massively disproportionately affect all conversations on Africa and the numbers that we've been talking about. So it's important to strip those two out most of the time to get a fairer picture. Yes, I think we will be seeing that. I mean, who would have thought this time last year we'd be where we are on Zimbabwe?
Good point. Very good
likewise
point.
On South Africa. But who would have thought we'd be where we are this time last year on the States or on the UK or on anywhere else, quite frankly. So risk is in the eye of the beholder. And I think that, if we've learned one thing in the last 15, 18 months, it's not to try and predict the future, certainly not from a political standpoint.
There's growing resilience around that. You make an important point, which is that, look, first of all, political risk is a global phenomenon. You'll find it anywhere. But it has been interesting to see that, we've had a coup in Zimbabwe, we've had the election dispute in Kenya, which we haven't touched on. And, 10, 15 years ago, you'd have people packing their bags and leaving, and taking their money with them. Our economy is more resilient now. People sort of starting to understand that, look, political risk in Africa is not this scary, crazy thing that you might think it is if you just watch CNN.
I think so. I'm glad you call it a coup and not me, because I'm not sure they're
supposed coup, just for the record.
So I think you look at Kenya. I mean, yes, there was paralysis for 6-7 months last year. Our business was personally impacted. I think everybody was, and yet now it feels like the market is set for really taking off there. And it's no great surprise that a lot of the winners from the last 2-3 years have been in East Africa, the sort of less oil dependent nations, less commodity dependent. So I would say watch that space, but very much we would expect lessons to be learnt on the ground.
All right, we're almost out of time, but I do want to get one last thing from you, William. If you had to pick your top 3 markets for 2018 or your top 3 sectors, what would they be?
Top 3 markets or sectors? Wow. I couldn't take my eye off Kenya. I think so much has been held back from last year's postponed elections that there's almost like the floodgates are waiting to open. I think the fundamentals look strong for Rwanda, Ethiopia. And I'm excited by what I see in Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal, those markets too. All
right, thank you very much, William. As always, take a close look at Africa. And as you said earlier, you have to be on the ground if you really want to know what's going on. No point just watching the news. From all of us here at The Business, thank you for watching. Please join us again next time.